The notary didn't look up right away. She finished reading the page she was on, set it face down on the desk, and folded her hands the way people do when they're choosing their words carefully. Then she looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, very quietly, "Mr. Calloway, when exactly did your mother pass away?" I told her. 3 weeks ago. February. Cold enough that the ground was still frozen and they had to delay the burial by 4 days. She nodded slowly. Then she turned her monitor toward me and pointed to a line near the bottom of the document on the screen. "This transfer was processed in January," she said, 6 weeks before she died. I stared at the number. Then I stared at the signature beside it. My mother's name. But not my mother's hand. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning starts not with a document or a lawyer's office, but with a shoebox my mother kept on the top shelf of her bedroom closet behind a stack of folded blankets in the house where I grew up. My name is Gerald Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a machinist at a plant outside Hamilton, Ontario. The kind of work that leaves your fingers permanently stiff in cold weather and your lower back sore by Thursday regardless of what you did Monday through Wednesday. I retired 4 years ago. I live alone now in a 2-bedroom place in Brantford, not far from where I was born. And until this past winter, the most complicated thing in my life was deciding whether the roof could survive another season or whether I needed to bite the bullet and call someone. My mother, Dorothy Calloway, was 81 when she died. She had lived in the same house in Ancaster for 47 years. Same yellow curtains in the kitchen, same wind chime on the porch that drove every neighbor on the street quietly insane from May to October. She outlived my father by 16 years, outlived 2 of her sisters, and had more energy than most people half her age, right up until the last year, when things started to slow down. She was sharp. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. Dorothy Calloway could quote the exact price she paid for every piece of furniture in that house, name every teacher I had from kindergarten through grade 9, and tell you the date of every family event going back 30 years without checking a single thing. Her memory was not the problem. My brother Raymond was the problem. Raymond is 58, 5 years younger than me. He never left Hamilton the way I did, but he also never quite stayed, if that makes sense. He bounced between jobs, between apartments, between explanations for why things hadn't worked out the way they should have. Our mother loved him the way mothers love the child who seems to need the most holding together. She didn't see what I saw, or maybe she did later, and that's what led to the shoebox. After the funeral, after the sandwiches and the tea and the quiet conversations about what a good woman she was and how she'd have hated all the fuss, Raymond took charge. That's the word for it. He stood in the kitchen of our mother's house with a clipboard he'd actually brought with him, walking through what needed to be sorted, what could be donated, what might fetch something at an estate sale. His wife Sandra stood beside him, making small, agreeable sounds and occasionally suggesting specific things should go in the donation pile before anyone else had a chance to look at them. I watched them from the doorway of the living room, holding a cup of tea. I'd stopped drinking and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly. Grief was already there, underneath everything. This was different. This was the specific discomfort of watching someone move through a space too quickly, too purposefully, as though they'd already decided what the space was worth. I drifted away from them, walked through the back hallway, past the bathroom with the pink tile my mother had always meant to replace, and ended up standing in her bedroom doorway. The bed was still made, her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. The closet door was slightly open, the way it always was, because the latch had needed fixing for 20 years and nobody had ever fixed it. I don't know what made me reach for the top shelf. Some instinct, maybe. Or maybe it was something she had said to me 8 months earlier when I'd come by in June to help her with the back garden. She'd been quiet most of the afternoon, and then while we were sitting on the porch with our coffee, she'd said, almost like it wasn't meant to be a serious thing, "Gerald, if anything ever happens to me, check the shelf in my closet behind the green blankets." I'd assume she meant her important papers, will, insurance, the deed to the house, the things everyone is supposed to keep somewhere sensible and never quite does. I pushed aside the blankets. The shoebox was there, taped shut with masking tape, My name written on the lid in her handwriting. Not Raymond's name, mine. I tucked it under my arm and left before anyone noticed. That night I sat at my kitchen table in Brentford and opened it. Inside were documents, receipts, printed emails, a notebook with pages filled in her careful small handwriting, and at the bottom a folded letter addressed to me. I read the letter first. She wrote that she was sorry, that she hadn't wanted to worry me, that she'd told herself for a long time it was probably just misunderstandings, accounting errors, things she didn't understand properly because she wasn't as sharp with financial matters as she used to be. That's what Raymond had told her when she asked questions, that she was confused, that the numbers were complicated and she shouldn't stress herself, but she had written things down. She'd been writing things down for 2 years. There were transfers from her accounts she didn't recognize, a change to her investment holdings she didn't recognize, a change to her investment holdings she didn't remember authorizing, a loan she supposedly co-signed for Raymond's business that she had no memory of signing. And at the bottom of the stack, a copy of a document, a broad power of attorney, with her signature on it. She wrote that the signature didn't look right to her, that her hand hadn't moved that way in years, not since the arthritis, that she had tried to ask her bank about it directly and been told the paperwork was in order. She wrote, "I don't know if I'm right, but I know I didn't sign that, and I know who did." At the very end, she wrote, "Don't ask Raymond, go to Patricia Chen." Patricia Chen was the notary my mother had used for decades, the woman who had witnessed the signing of my parents' wills, their property documents, every legal paper they'd ever needed. My mother had trusted her completely. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Raymond called before 8. He sounded warm, helpful, slightly overworked in the way he always did when he wanted to seem like he was carrying more than his share. "Hey," he said, "Sandra and I are heading back to Mom's today to start going through things properly. You should come. We want to make sure everything's divided fairly." "I have some things to take care of," I said. A pause. Brief, but there. "What kind of things?" "Estate stuff," I said. "Loose ends." Another pause. "You know, the lawyer we've been working with can handle all of that. You don't need to go tracking things down separately. It just makes it more complicated." I didn't know they had a lawyer. She hadn't mentioned that. "Good to know," I said, and kept my voice as steady as I could. "I'll call you later." I hung up and sat with that word, we been working with, as though he'd already assembled a team, already had a structure in place, and I was the one approaching things incorrectly by not being part of it. I drove to Patricia Chen's office in Hamilton. It's above a dry cleaner on a street that used to have a hardware store on the corner, the kind of neighborhood that's been almost gentrifying for 20 years without quite committing. Her office is small and very organized, the kind of place where nothing is ever where you don't expect it to be. Patricia is in her late 60s now, small and precise in her movements, the sort of person who gives you the impression that she has never once sent a document to the wrong address. She had known my mother since before I was in high school. She rose when I came in, shook my hand with both of hers, and said how sorry she was. Then she said, "I've been hoping you would come." She didn't wait for me to explain why I was there. She sat down, folded her hands on the desk, and told me she had concerns. The power of attorney document that had been filed, the broad one, the one that gave Raymond full authority over my mother's financial and legal affairs, had not been witnessed by her. She showed me her copy of the limited power of attorney she had helped my mother prepare 3 years ago. Medical decisions only, narrowly defined, witnessed properly, signed at a time when my mother was unquestionably well. The document Raymond had been using was different, broader, backdated, and the notarization stamp on it belonged to a notary in Mississauga whom Patricia knew slightly and whose work she said she had reason to question. "I made inquiries," Patricia said carefully, "after your mother came to see me last October. I looked up. She came to see you." "She came to see me," Patricia said. She was frightened. She brought some papers she didn't recognize her own signature on. She was afraid that if she made a formal complaint, Raymond would find out and she'd be left alone. He was the one driving her to her appointments by then. He was the one who talked to her doctors. The dry cleaner below us hummed faintly. Someone's keys jingled in the hallway outside. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her to write everything down, Patricia said, and to give it to someone she trusted, someone Raymond didn't have access to. She turned her monitor toward me then. Showed me the transfer, January, 6 weeks before my mother died. A large sum moved out of my mother's non-registered investment account into a numbered company I had never heard of. Is that her signature? Patricia asked, pointing to the authorization form on the screen. I looked at it for a long time. My mother's name, formed carefully, but without the slight hesitation she had developed in the last few years, without the slight rightward drift caused by the arthritis in her right hand that I had watched develop slowly over a decade. No, I said. That's not how she signed. Patricia nodded once. I've already contacted someone, she said, but I needed you to be here when I made the next call. She picked up her phone, dialed, and spoke in a low, even tone to someone on the other end. When she hung up, she looked at me across the desk. There's a woman from the Ontario Securities Commission who has been looking at a connected matter involving that numbered company, she said. Your mother's account isn't the only one, but it may be the clearest example of what they've been trying to document. She told me what came next. I couldn't talk to Raymond, couldn't confront Sandra, couldn't even ask questions that might signal what I knew. The investigation was at a stage where any warning would compromise things. She said, "Can you do that? Can you act normally for a little while?" I thought about my mother sitting across from Patricia Chen 6 months ago, frightened, alone, handing over a stack of papers she'd been quietly gathering while the person she had raised was slowly taking everything she had raised, was slowly taking everything she had. Yes, I said, I can do that. I drove back to Brantford through grey February light, the shoebox on the seat beside me, and I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn the radio on. That evening Raymond called again. He mentioned 3 times in the course of 10 minutes that he was only trying to make things as simple as possible, that our mother had wanted everything handled smoothly, that some of her later paperwork had been done in a rush and might look confusing to someone who didn't understand the full context. I said almost nothing, just enough. I've learned in 63 years that silence unsettles people who are trying to manage you far more than arguments do. The following days were a particular kind of awful that's hard to explain. I went to my mother's house when Raymond wasn't there and walked through the rooms. Already things were missing. A painting that had hung in the hallway since my childhood. The good china that had been my grandmother's. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I went home and wrote it down with dates and descriptions, the way my mother had done before me, the two of us building the same record from different ends of the same timeline. I called a lawyer, not the one Raymond mentioned, someone of my own choosing, a woman in Hamilton who specialized in estate litigation and elder law. Her name was Carol Dempsey. She was direct and slightly impatient in a way I found reassuring, the way a good doctor is slightly impatient because they don't want to waste your time or theirs. She read through the contents of the shoebox over the course of an afternoon while I sat in her waiting room. When she came out, she said, "Your mother was very thorough." It sounded like the highest compliment she knew how to give. She filed what needed to be filed. She contacted Patricia Chen. She made calls I wasn't party to and sent documents I didn't see until later. And she told me to continue doing what I was doing, being unremarkable, being cooperative, giving Raymond no reason to move faster than he already was. A week later, she called me at 7 in the morning. The OSC executed a search warrant on the numbered company, she said. They also got records from Raymond's personal accounts and Sandra's. Gerald, the transfers go back 4 years. 4 years. I sat down on the edge of my bed. He wasn't in financial trouble, I asked. It was the question I'd been carrying, the one that might have made some of it explicable, if not forgivable. He was doing fine, Carol said. The business wasn't struggling. This wasn't desperation. This was planning. 4 years. My mother had been in that house for 4 years with the slow realization growing in her that something was wrong, that the numbers didn't add up, that the son she drove to hockey practice and helped through 3 failed attempts at launching a career was helping himself to everything she had built with my father over 50 years. And she had not fallen apart. She had written things down. The arrests came on a Tuesday morning. Carol told me the night before. Simultaneous, she said. Raymond's house and the office of the numbered company, which turned out to be a storage unit in Stony Creek that had been converted just enough to have a mailing address. I was in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Brantford when my phone rang with the confirmation. I had a coffee I wasn't drinking. An older man at the next table was reading a newspaper and occasionally tutting at whatever he found in it. The sky was the flat white of a February afternoon in southern Ontario, the kind of light that doesn't cast shadows. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt very tired, and then, underneath the tired, something quieter. Something like the feeling of a long-standing pressure finally releasing. Not gone, but gone from the place it had been sitting. Raymond's lawyer called that afternoon. He was professional in the way that means polished rather than honest. He said his client wanted to resolve the matter without prolonged legal proceedings. He said there were aspects of the situation that were more complicated than they appeared. He said the word misunderstanding twice, as though repetition might eventually make it accurate. I told him my mother had documented 4 years of transactions in a notebook she kept hidden behind blankets on a closet shelf because she was afraid of her own son. He said that was a very one-sided characterization. I told him I had nothing further to add and to contact Carol Dempsey, and I hung up. The case took 8 months to resolve. I won't pretend that wasn't hard. Sitting in a lawyer's office going through financial documents is not grief. It doesn't look like grief, but it is a particular kind of loss, revisiting 4 years of your mother's life through the lens of what was being done to her while she made her meals and tended her garden and answered her phone and tried very hard to figure out who she could trust. She had figured it out. She'd figured it out while she was afraid and isolated and being told by the person doing it to her that she was the one who was confused. The court proceedings were in Hamilton. Raymond sat beside his lawyer in a grey suit I didn't recognize and for most of it didn't look at me. Sandra sat in the gallery with her arms crossed and her expression fixed in something that wanted to be righteous indignation and fell several stops short. The Crown prosecutor was unhurried and extremely organized. She had been doing this kind of work for a long time, and it showed, not in drama, but in the methodical removal, one layer at a time, of every alternative explanation Raymond's side had attempted to construct. The handwriting expert testified about the signature discrepancies. She used photographs projected on a screen, pointing to the specifics of my mother's real signature, the slight upward angle, the compressed loop in the year of Dorothy, the inconsistency that comes from genuine arthritis, beside the forged version, which was cleaner, more uniform. The work of someone who had practiced but didn't know what real aging hands look like. Patricia Chen testified about the original limited power of attorney, the one my mother had actually requested, and about my mother's visit to her office in October. Carol Dempsey presented the financial timeline. 4 years of transfers, small enough individually to avoid automatic flags, consistent enough in aggregate to total just under $340,000. Raymond's lawyer argued that the transfers had been made with my mother's knowledge and consent, that she had been increasingly confused in her later years and may simply not have remembered authorizing them, that Raymond had been her primary caregiver and had naturally been entrusted with financial matters. The judge asked 3 questions. The first was whether there was any contemporaneous documentation of my mother's consent. There was not. The second was whether Raymond had ever reported his mother's supposed confusion to her physician. He had not. The third was why a woman her lawyer, a notary, both described as sharp and meticulous in her record-keeping, would have needed her son to manage her financial affairs without her apparent awareness. Raymond's lawyer had a long answer to the third question. The judge listened to it without expression and wrote something down. Sentencing came 5 weeks later. Fraud over $5,000. Breach of trust. Misuse of power of attorney. 4 years in a federal institution. Full restitution ordered. Sandra had already retained her own counsel by then, which told me everything about how confident she was in Raymond's story. I stood outside the courthouse afterward in the cold March air, and Carol shook my hand and said she hoped this gave me some peace. I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about my mother sitting at her kitchen table in the evenings with her notebook, writing things down in her careful handwriting, building a case she wasn't sure anyone would ever use because it was the only thing she could do that Raymond couldn't take away from her. It gives us some peace, I said. That matters more. The financial recovery took nearly a year. Much of what had been taken came back through the restitution order. Some of it, the things sold off quietly before we caught everything, didn't. The painting from the hallway never turned up. The china is gone. What remained was enough to handle properly. I worked with Carol and Patricia to make sure the estate was settled the way my mother had actually intended, documented in the original will Raymond hadn't managed to have replaced. A portion went to a community program in Hamilton that provided grocery delivery and home visits to elderly residents living alone. My mother had volunteered there briefly years ago and had talked about it with the particular warmth she reserved for things she thought mattered. I kept the house for a few months before I could bring myself to deal with it. Would drive out sometimes on a Sunday and just sit in the driveway. Then one afternoon I walked through it room by room, slowly touching things, and it didn't feel the way I expected. It didn't feel like loss exactly. It felt more like testimony. All those years of ordinary life recorded in the worn spots on the floors and the curtains she'd washed so many times the pattern had faded and the wind chime still hanging on the porch. I sold the house to a young family in the fall. They had a 4-year-old daughter who ran through the rooms ahead of her parents during the walkthrough, making happy sounds, and I thought my mother would have liked that very much. The shoebox I kept. It sits on the shelf in my spare room now. I haven't gone through it again since the trial. I don't need to. I know what's in it. I know what it cost her to put it together. Raymond wrote to me from the institution in December. 3 pages, handwritten. I won't say what was in it because I don't think it matters, and because some documents are not worth preserving. I didn't write back. There are people who will tell you that family is family. That blood means you owe each other more than you owe strangers, more than you owe truth, more than you owe the woman who raised you and loved you imperfectly and tried her best across 81 years of living. I think my mother understood something that took me longer to learn. That love doesn't protect you from the people who are supposed to love you. That the only real protection is documentation, patience, and trusting the right person with the evidence before it's too late. She couldn't fight it herself. She was 80 years old, and she was afraid, and she was being told by her own son that her memory was failing. So she did what she could do. She watched carefully. She wrote it down. She taped a shoebox shut and put my name on it and hid it where she knew I would look. She didn't ask me to save her. She just trusted me to finish the job. I think about her most mornings when I make my coffee. The particular way she took hers, 1 sugar, strong, always in the same blue mug she'd had since before I was born. The way she'd stand at the kitchen window and look out at the garden and not say anything for a while. Just look. She was not confused. She was not frail. She was an 81-year-old woman doing the most careful and courageous thing she knew how to do, alone in the house where she had lived her whole life. And she was right. I keep thinking about the masking tape my mother used to seal that shoebox. She didn't use a lot of it. Just enough. A few careful strips across the seam, my name written on top in the handwriting I've known my whole life. She didn't know exactly when I'd find it, or whether I'd act on what was inside. She just did what she could do, as carefully as she could do it, and trusted the rest to me. That's the part that stays with me. Not the courtroom, not the sentencing, not the number the notary pointed to on her screen. It's the tape. The care of it, the quiet decision a frightened 80-year-old woman made to keep going, to keep documenting, to keep believing that the truth she was writing down would eventually matter to someone. Raymond had every advantage in that situation. He had access, he had proximity. He had 4 years and a forged signature and a story ready to go about a mother who was confused, who didn't really understand her own finances, who needed someone to manage things on her behalf. That story almost worked. It would have worked if my mother had been the kind of person who gave up when things got hard and frightening and lonely. She wasn't that kind of person. And I think Raymond, for all his planning, had miscalculated that. What he took from her was real. The money, yes, but also the years of quietly wondering if she was the one who had it wrong. That's a particular cruelty, telling someone their own memory can't be trusted. It isolates them from their own judgment at exactly the moment they need it most. My mother sat with that doubt for years, and she kept writing things down anyway. She kept questioning anyway. She kept the receipts and the bank statements and the printouts, and she taped them into a box with my name on it, because she had decided that not knowing for certain was not the same thing as being wrong. That took something I'm not sure I would have had in her position, a kind of integrity that doesn't depend on being believed or validated or protected. She did the right thing because it was the right thing, even when no one was watching, and there was no one was watching, and there was no guarantee it would ever lead anywhere. I've thought a lot, in the months since all of this ended, about what I actually owe her. Not in a financial sense, in the other sense. The way her patience and her clear-headedness made it possible for me to walk into Patricia Chen's office with something solid, something that couldn't be easily dismissed. She handed me the means to finish what she'd started. That required me to be careful too, to think rather than react, to hold the shape of normal long enough for the investigation to do its work. That was hard. Some mornings it was very hard. I don't think either of us did anything extraordinary. I think we just paid attention, wrote things down, asked the right person for help instead of the convenient one, and when the moment came to act, we didn't hesitate because we'd already done the thinking. My mother deserved better than what happened to her, but she handled what happened to her with more dignity and more intelligence than most people will ever have to summon. The shoebox is still on my shelf. I'm not sure I'll ever move it.